In the heart of a packed courtroom, the tension was palpable. The defendant, a black woman, stood composed, her face a mask of quiet strength as she faced the officer across the room. Without warning, the officer lunged forward, his hand striking her across the face with brutal force. The gasp of the onlookers filled the air, their disbelief mirrored by the judge's stunned silence. The officer sneered at her, his words cutting through the room. "Shut your mouth." The woman didn't flinch. But the shock didn't end there. Moments later, as the officer's face twisted in arrogance, he would come to a horrifying realization that shattered his world. You won't believe what happens next. Stay with us as this drama unfolds, revealing a twist no one could have predicted. As the courtroom fell into an eerie silence, the officer stood frozen, his face draining of color as the woman, his supposed victim, slowly rose to her feet. The reality of the situation began to sink in. She wasn't just anyone. She wasn't a helpless bystander. She wasn't even a mere victim. No, she was the very person who would determine his fate. She was the newly appointed police chief, the very one he had underestimated, the one he had slapped in front of everyone. The realization hit him like a freight train, but it was too late. The damage was already done. The audience in the room, still reeling from the shock of the slap, now found themselves witnessing something much more powerful, an instant shift in power dynamics. The officer, once brimming with arrogance, now found himself powerless, exposed for the ignorant, prejudiced figure he truly was. She, on the other hand, stood there with grace and unwavering calm, as if she had expected this moment all along. Her silence spoke volumes, while his outburst only dug his grave deeper. The judge, who had been speechless up until this point, now cleared his throat, his voice quivering slightly. "Officer," he began, his eyes narrowing, "you've made a grave mistake, and I'm afraid there will be consequences." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight, and for the officer, they were the final nails in his coffin. He looked around the courtroom, his face now a mix of fear and disbelief. As the camera flashes captured the unfolding spectacle, his colleagues, once allies, now avoided his gaze, realizing that they were witnessing the fall of a man who had abused his power and authority. The woman, however, didn't look at him with contempt or rage. Instead, she met his eyes with an unyielding, calm stare. She knew what was coming next. Without speaking a word, she turned to the room's security detail and simply nodded. In that instant, two officers stepped forward, their eyes trained on the officer who had just slapped her. It was not a request, it was a command. "Please escort Officer Johnson out of the courtroom," the woman said softly, her voice carrying an air of authority that only those who held real power could convey. The officer, now realizing that his fate was sealed, tried to speak, to beg, but his words were drowned out by the sound of his own heartbeat thumping in his ears. He was no longer in control. He had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. As the security officers led him out of the room, he passed the woman once more. This time their eyes met, but there was no anger in hers. No words were spoken. There was only an unspoken understanding that he had just witnessed the full extent of her power and that his time had come to an end. The woman turned back to face the judge, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. She was no longer the victim of a slap. She was the person who had turned the tables in the most dramatic and public way possible. As the courtroom settled back into silence, the weight of what had just transpired began to sink in for everyone present. The officer was gone, his career likely over, and the woman, who had suffered the slap, now stood as a symbol of justice and unassailable power. It was clear, no one would ever underestimate her again. As the courtroom doors slammed shut behind Officer Johnson, the tension that had lingered in the air seemed to dissipate, but only for a moment. The woman, now standing tall and poised in the center of the room, slowly turned her attention back to the judge. Her eyes were unwavering, filled with quiet determination, as if she had already decided how she would handle the aftermath of this shocking encounter. The judge, still visibly shaken, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses, clearly unsettled by the events that had just unfolded. I must apologize, ma'am," he began, his voice shaky. "This behavior, it is unacceptable." The woman nodded slowly, acknowledging his words but offering nothing more. She had heard enough apologies in her lifetime to know that they meant little when actions spoke louder. Her silence, however, spoke volumes. As the judge continued to fumble through his paperwork, trying to regain control of the proceedings, the woman's mind was already racing. She knew this moment was bigger than just the slap. This was about sending a message, about making sure that no one would ever underestimate her or anyone like her again. She had worked too hard to get here, to be taken seriously, to be dismissed or belittled by anyone, especially not someone like Officer Johnson. Her path to power had been long, filled with struggles that most people couldn't even imagine, and this moment was the culmination of everything she had fought for. But it wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had been marginalized, who had been told they didn't belong, who had been treated as less than. She was no longer a victim in that courtroom. She was a force to be reckoned with, and Officer Johnson had just learned that the hard way. The room, which had been eerily quiet just moments before, was now buzzing with energy. The onlookers, who had watched in stunned silence, were beginning to whisper amongst themselves. Some of them couldn't believe what they had just witnessed, while others were taking in the significance of it all. The woman, however, was unfazed by the murmurs. She had known from the beginning that this would be a battle, and now she was ready for the war. As the judge finally regained his composure, he looked up at her with a mix of respect and hesitation. "It seems there are matters that need to be addressed, ma'am," he said carefully. "We will proceed with the case." She nodded again, her gaze never wavering. "Of course," she said softly, her voice carrying authority. "But first let me make one thing clear. This will not be swept under the rug. Officer Johnson's actions will not go unpunished, and the world will know that this behavior is not acceptable in any form. I will not rest until justice is served. Not just for me, but for everyone who has faced injustice because of their race, their gender, or their background. This ends now." The room fell silent once more, but this time, the silence was different. It was a silence filled with anticipation, with the knowledge that the woman had just set something in motion that could not be undone. As the proceedings continued, no one in that room would ever forget the lesson that had been delivered. Officer Johnson's slap had ignited a fire, but it was the woman's quiet strength, her unshakable resolve, that would leave a lasting mark on everyone who had witnessed the events unfold. She was no longer just a black woman in a courtroom. She was a symbol of power, of justice, and of the undeniable force that was her presence. The atmosphere in the courtroom shifted, the weight of the woman's words lingering in the air like a storm waiting to break. The judge, now visibly more cautious, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He could sense that this was not going to be a simple resolution. There was something deeper at play here, something that stretched far beyond the simple rules of the courtroom. The woman, the newly appointed police chief, stood tall, her gaze fixed ahead with unyielding intensity. She had been through so much to get here, to earn the right to stand at the front of this room, to not just be heard but to be respected. And now, in the wake of Officer Johnson's actions, she would make sure that respect was demanded, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been wronged or dismissed. The murmurs of the audience grew louder, their whispers now filled with curiosity and excitement. They had seen the officer's downfall, and now they were witnessing the beginning of something much bigger, a reckoning that could change everything. The woman's power was no longer a secret, her presence commanded attention, and her words carried weight. As the judge called for order, the woman stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise with effortless authority. "This case is not just about one officer's mistake," she said, her tone cold but filled with resolve. "This is about a system that has allowed this behavior to persist for far too long. It is about a culture of abuse, a culture where people like Officer Johnson believe they can act with impunity, without fear of consequences. Well, today that ends." She paused, letting the gravity of her words settle in, her eyes scanning the room. Every person present knew this was no longer just about a single incident. This was about a larger battle, a battle against a system that had allowed racial discrimination and abuse to fester unchecked. "I will ensure that Officer Johnson faces the consequences of his actions, and I will make sure that everyone knows this type of behavior will no longer be tolerated," she continued, her voice steady and unwavering. "But I will also make sure that the entire police department is held accountable. This is not an isolated issue. This is a systemic problem that we must address head-on." The audience fell silent, each word she spoke adding weight to the moment. The judge, though still uneasy, nodded slowly. He understood now that the woman before him was not just a figure of authority, but a force that could not be ignored. The case had taken on a new dimension, one that could have far-reaching implications. "We will begin the investigation into Officer Johnson's conduct immediately," the judge said, his voice now more resolute. "And we will ensure that all necessary steps are taken to address the deeper issues you have raised." The woman nodded, her eyes locked onto his, a silent understanding passing between them. She had fought for this moment, for the opportunity to make a real difference. And now the wheels of change were set into motion. As the proceedings continued, it became clear to everyone in the room that they were witnessing history in the making. This was no longer just about one officer's misconduct. It was about a movement that would change the way power and justice were understood. The woman, once a victim of discrimination, now stood as a symbol of justice, strength, and an unwavering commitment to ensure that no one would ever be treated with the same disregard again. As the courtroom proceedings moved forward, the atmosphere remained heavy with the tension of the moment. The woman, now fully in control of the situation, stood as a pillar of unwavering strength. Her words had set the course for the days to come, and the judge, once skeptical, was now visibly engaged in the process. Officer Johnson had been escorted out, but the ripples of his actions were far from over. The woman knew that this was just the beginning, and the real work was only starting. The room fell silent once again as she prepared to speak, her voice clear and powerful, cutting through the heavy air. "This is about more than just one officer. This is about changing the system," she said, her gaze sweeping over the people present. "It is about making sure that people like Officer Johnson cannot get away with mistreating others simply because of their position or their skin color. It is about breaking down the barriers that have allowed racism and discrimination to thrive in places of power." She paused for a moment, her eyes locking with the judges as she continued. "You are all witnesses to what happened today, but this cannot be the end. This cannot be swept under the rug or forgotten. This moment must serve as a turning point, a warning that we will no longer tolerate this behavior in our justice system." The judge, now fully aware of the gravity of the situation, nodded slowly. He had seen many cases in his years of service, but never one quite like this. This was not just a matter of legal proceedings. It was a fight for justice, for dignity, and for the very soul of the police force. "We understand, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady but respectful. "The investigation will proceed, and the necessary actions will be taken. We will ensure that the truth comes to light." The woman nodded, but she knew better than to take such assurances at face value. She had been in the system long enough to understand how easily things could be swept aside, how easily powerful people could make problems disappear. "I trust you will," she said, her voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority. "But this cannot be an isolated incident. This is a systemic issue that needs to be addressed from the top down. I expect to see real, tangible change, not just words." The judge met her gaze once again, a flicker of understanding passing between them. He knew that this would not be a simple case, nor would it be a quick resolution. But he also understood that the woman before him was not someone who could be dismissed or silenced. She had already proven that. As the room settled into a tense silence, the woman turned to face the other side of the courtroom, her eyes scanning the crowd of onlookers. They had seen the slap, the humiliation, the rawness of the moment. But now they were about to witness something far more powerful. A woman taking control of her destiny, demanding justice for herself and for those who had been denied it for far too long. The next steps would not be easy, and there would undoubtedly be resistance, but the woman was ready. She had prepared for this, fought for this, and she would not back down. The stakes had never been higher, but neither had her resolve. As the proceedings continued, it became clear to everyone present that this case was not just about one officer's misconduct. It was about something much larger, a fight for justice that would reverberate far beyond the walls of that courtroom. And with each passing moment, the woman's strength and resolve grew even more unshakable. As the days passed, the weight of the events in the courtroom continued to echo through the halls of the police department. The woman, the newly appointed police chief, had set the stage for what would come next. She had made her stance clear, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been mistreated or marginalized. The incident with Officer Johnson had sparked a fire, but it was far from over. Now it was time for her to follow through on her promise, to make sure that this was not just another case swept under the rug, that this moment would be remembered, and that justice would be served. In the days that followed, the investigation into Officer Johnson's conduct moved swiftly. The Internal Audit Department, which had long been known for its slow and often reluctant action, suddenly sprang into motion. Files were being pulled, records were being reviewed, and interviews were being conducted. The woman's presence in the department had already begun to make a difference. Her appointment as police chief had not only disrupted the balance of power in the department, but had also sent a message to everyone. Things were changing. No longer would abuse of power and discrimination be tolerated. Officer Johnson's case became a symbol, a moment that could no longer be ignored or brushed aside. As the investigation unfolded, the woman kept her focus sharp. She attended meetings, made phone calls, and demanded updates on the case, ensuring that nothing slipped through the cracks. She knew that any hesitation or delay would only undermine the progress she had already made. She could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing down on her, but she also felt a surge of determination. This was not just about one officer, it was about transforming the culture within the department, about proving that power could be wielded for justice, not oppression. One afternoon, as she sat in her office reviewing the latest reports, her phone rang. It was the lead investigator on the case. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency, "we've got the evidence we need. The case against Officer Johnson is solid, and we're moving forward with the disciplinary hearings." The woman leaned back in her chair, allowing herself a brief moment of relief. It had taken longer than she had hoped, but the wheels of justice were turning. She knew this was only the beginning, though. The real work lay ahead. The hearing would be public, and it would be a chance for her to make sure the world knew that this kind of behavior would not be tolerated, that those who wielded power would be held accountable. As the hearing date approached, the media began to take notice. News outlets picked up the story, and soon the courtroom would be filled with reporters, cameras, and spectators. The woman had prepared herself for the spotlight, but she knew this wasn't about her. It was about sending a message to everyone who had ever been wronged, to everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. She would stand in that courtroom not just as a woman, but as a symbol of change, of power, and of justice. The time had come for the world to see the truth, and she would make sure that Officer Johnson and everyone like him would never forget the lesson that was about to unfold. The day of the hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed with reporters, lawyers, and curious onlookers, all eager to witness the fallout from Officer Johnson's actions. The media buzzed with excitement, cameras flashing as they captured every moment, every detail, and the anticipation in the room was palpable. The woman, now standing at the center of the room in her full police chief uniform, exuded an air of confidence and authority that made it clear this was her moment. As she walked into the courtroom, the whispers and murmurs from the audience slowly faded into silence. It was no longer just about the incident with Officer Johnson. It was about a public reckoning, a statement of power that would echo far beyond the walls of this courthouse. Her presence was commanding, and everyone in the room understood that she was not to be underestimated. The judge called the hearing to order, and Officer Johnson, now facing the full weight of the law, stood at the defendant's table, his once steadfast demeanor faltering under the scrutiny of the public. The woman, standing tall and unflinching, locked eyes with him for a moment. There was no animosity in her gaze, only the quiet, resolute strength of someone who had fought to get here. The hearing began, and the room was filled with testimony and evidence. Witnesses who had been present during the incident spoke up, recounting the officer's actions and the tension that had filled the air when he slapped her across the face. The woman's face remained composed, but inside, she felt the weight of every word, every memory. This was more than just a case. This was a moment of reckoning for the system that had allowed people like Officer Johnson to operate without consequence. As the testimony continued, the media began to pick up on something significant. This was not just a case of misconduct, it was a systemic problem that had been allowed to thrive in the shadows for far too long. The woman, though visibly composed, knew that the stakes were higher than ever. She had to make sure that this hearing was not just about Officer Johnson, but about the culture that had enabled his behavior. She could feel the eyes of the world on her as she prepared to take the stand. When the time came for her to speak, the room fell silent. She stood before the judge, her posture straight and unwavering, and addressed the court with a calm authority that made everyone listen. "This is not about one officer's mistake," she said, her voice carrying across the room. "This is about a culture of abuse, a culture that has long been allowed to fester and grow unchecked. It is about the silence that has protected people like Officer Johnson for far too long." Her words hung in the air, a powerful indictment of the very system she had dedicated her life to reforming. This is a systemic issue, not an isolated incident. We must acknowledge that this behavior, this abuse of power, is not the exception, it is the rule. And until we address that, we will continue to see more officers like Johnson, more victims like me. The room was dead silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone in the courtroom. The judge's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Officer Johnson's confidence seemed to have evaporated. The woman continued, her voice unwavering, "I am here not just to seek justice for myself, but for every person who has been mistreated, for every person who has been belittled, ignored, or oppressed. This is not just about today, it is about the future, about ensuring that no one else will have to suffer because of a system that is broken. The room, once filled with nervous energy, now sat in stunned silence. She had spoken truth to power, and everyone knew that this hearing was not just about holding one officer accountable, it was about changing the way things worked, about breaking down the walls of silence and complicity. The woman had made her point, and in doing so had made history. As the woman finished her testimony, the courtroom was still. The weight of her words hung in the air, a silence so thick it could be felt by everyone present. Officer Johnson, who had once stood confidently, now appeared diminished. His shoulders slumped as he faced the overwhelming evidence of his actions. The public, who had gathered in the courtroom and outside, watched intently, knowing that this moment would not just define one officer's fate, but could set a precedent for the entire justice system. The judge, his expression now grim, adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "I've heard enough," he said quietly, but with the firm tone of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. "The evidence is clear, and the testimony from the police chief has left no doubt in my mind about the seriousness of this matter." Officer Johnson's eyes shifted nervously, his once cocky demeanor now replaced with anxiety. He tried to open his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The public had turned their focus from him to the woman who had risen from the depths of adversity to stand as a beacon of strength and justice. The woman, undeterred by the stillness in the room, remained composed, her gaze unwavering as she stared straight ahead. This was not a moment for celebration, it was a moment for reflection, for realizing the depth of the change that was about to unfold. Officer Johnson had thought he could act with impunity, that his badge and his position could shield him from the consequences of his actions. But the woman had shown him that no one was beyond accountability, no matter how powerful they believed themselves to be. She had turned the tables in the most dramatic way possible, and now the entire room was about to witness the consequences of his actions. The judge leaned forward, his voice sharp as he addressed the officer. "Officer Johnson, you have betrayed the trust of the public and violated the very principles that you swore to uphold. I find you guilty of misconduct, and I will be recommending the immediate termination of your employment." The words hit Officer Johnson like a punch to the gut. He stood there, frozen, unable to respond. The courtroom, which had been filled with tension just moments before, now buzzed with the realization that justice had been served. The woman, the newly appointed police chief, stood tall and steady as the judge's words echoed in the room. She had not only ensured that Officer Johnson was held accountable, but she had also sent a message to everyone who had ever been mistreated or discriminated against. There would be no more silence, no more complicity, no more hiding behind power. The culture of abuse and racism that had festered for so long was being exposed for what it was. And now, the real work would begin. As the courtroom began to empty, the woman stood at the center, her presence commanding and resolute. The fight was far from over, but she had proven that the system could change, that those in power could be held accountable. She had turned her pain into power, her struggle into strength. This moment, this victory, was a victory not just for her, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice. The message was clear. No one could ever look down on her or anyone like her again. In the days following the hearing, the reverberations of the judgment spread quickly, not just within the police department, but across the entire city. News outlets covered every aspect of the trial, from the shocking slap to the powerful testimony delivered by the woman who had become a symbol of justice and resilience. The case of Officer Johnson was the talk of the town, and people were starting to realize that the woman, the newly appointed police chief, had not only made history but was also beginning to change the culture of law enforcement from the inside out. It didn't take long before her actions became a rallying cry for those who had been ignored, oppressed, and silenced for far too long. Protesters once ignored found their voices amplified. The public began to question the system, and the woman's name became synonymous with accountability and change. The message was clear. Injustice would no longer be tolerated. As the days turned into weeks, the woman remained focused. She didn't bask in the glory of the media attention. She didn't take a victory lap. There was still much work to be done. Officer Johnson's termination was only the beginning. The department needed reform, true, systemic change, and she was determined to lead that charge. Her office, once a place of administrative paperwork and routine operations, had become the headquarters for a new movement, a movement that sought to expose the deeply ingrained biases and abuses within the system. The woman met with community leaders, activists, and fellow officers who shared her vision for a better, more just system. She worked tirelessly, pushing forward policies that prioritize transparency, accountability, and equality. She knew that changing the culture of an institution as large and entrenched as the police department would not be easy, but she was no stranger to difficult battles. She had fought for her place at the table, and now she would fight to ensure that those who followed in her footsteps would not face the same prejudice and discrimination that she had. But the road ahead was not without resistance. There were those within the department who were unwilling to let go of their power, who saw her reforms as a threat to the status quo. They whispered behind closed doors, attempting to undermine her at every turn. But the woman had learned to tune out the noise. She had faced worse than whispers, she had faced direct attacks, and she had come out stronger every time. The deeper she dug into the department's history, the more she uncovered. She found cases of racial profiling, instances of excessive force that had been swept under the rug, and a culture that had allowed officers like Johnson to operate with impunity. With every revelation, her resolve grew. She knew that she couldn't do this alone, and she didn't want to. This was a collective effort, and together they would reshape the future of policing. As the months passed, the woman's influence continued to grow. Her vision for a police department that was accountable to the people and committed to justice was taking shape. And while there was still much work to be done, the foundation had been laid. The public's faith in the department was slowly being restored. People were beginning to believe that change was not only possible, but that it was already happening. The woman had proven that one person, when driven by purpose and supported by the right people, could spark a revolution. And with every step she took, she reminded everyone that justice, no matter how long it takes, always has a way of prevailing. As the months passed, the woman's vision for reform began to take root more deeply within the police department. The pressure to maintain the changes she had initiated only grew as the demands for justice echoed throughout the community. Every new policy, every meeting, and every reform she pushed forward faced resistance, but it was clear that her presence was beginning to shift the tides. Despite the opposition, she stood resolute, unwilling to back down no matter the cost. She had already faced the unimaginable, the slap in the courtroom, and emerged, not just unbroken but empowered. Her journey had been long and exhausting, but the results were undeniable. More and more officers came forward, willing to speak about the deep-rooted issues within the department. And with each new whistleblower, the walls of silence began to crumble. The woman knew that this wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been mistreated, overlooked, and denied justice for far too long. She saw herself in their stories and, in turn, had become a beacon for those who had once been voiceless. The work was slow, but with each victory, the department began to change. New procedures were put into place to combat racial profiling, and officers who had previously been protected by the system were now being held accountable for their actions. The department was beginning to rebuild its relationship with the community, slowly but surely. However, not everyone was pleased with these changes. The old guard, those who had relied on the status quo, began to push back harder. They whispered in the shadows, organizing campaigns to discredit her, to make her seem like an outsider, an unwelcome force trying to tear apart their system. But the woman was ready. She had been prepared for this battle long before her rise to power. The battle for justice was never easy, and she had learned that the harder the fight, the sweeter the victory. One evening, as she sat alone in her office, the weight of the day pressing down on her, her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Ma'am?" the voice on the other end said. "We've just uncovered another case, one that's been buried for years. It's a clear example of racial discrimination, and we have the evidence to back it up." The woman's heart raced as she listened, her instincts kicking into high gear. The fight for justice was far from over. In fact, it was intensifying. But she was ready. She had never been more ready. She knew that every victory, no matter how small, was a step closer to the ultimate goal, a justice system that truly served the people, that protected the innocent, and held the powerful accountable. She had already proven that change was possible, but now it was time to prove that change could be sustained. She stood up from her desk, looking out the window at the city she had sworn to protect. The fight was far from over, but in that moment, she knew that she was not alone. She had built a coalition, a community of people who were willing to fight alongside her, people who believed in the same vision. As she prepared for the next steps in the battle, she couldn't help but think about everything she had accomplished. The journey had been difficult, but it had also been rewarding. And as long as there was work to be done, she would continue the fight because justice had always been worth the struggle. As the investigation into the department's long-standing issues continued, the woman's resolve never wavered. Every day brought new challenges, new obstacles to overcome, but each moment only strengthened her commitment to the cause. The public, too, had begun to take notice. What started as a small ripple of change was now a movement, one that had gathered momentum and was pushing forward with unstoppable force. She could feel the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, but she also felt the powerful support of those who believed in her vision. Her leadership was transforming not only the police department, but also the community it served. People began to trust her, to see her not just as a figurehead, but as someone who understood their pain, their struggles, and their hopes for a better future. One afternoon, as she sat in her office going over reports, her phone buzzed. It was a call from one of her trusted allies within the department. "Ma'am," the voice on the other end said, "we've got a breakthrough. We've just uncovered a massive cover-up involving several senior officers. The evidence is overwhelming, and we're ready to move forward." Her heart skipped a beat, but she remained calm, knowing that this was the moment she had been waiting for. The system was finally cracking open, and the truth was being exposed. "Proceed," she said, her voice steady. "This needs to be handled with precision and care. We can't afford to make mistakes now." The phone call ended, and she sat back in her chair, taking a deep breath. This was the moment she had anticipated since taking office, the moment when she would dismantle the corrupt structures that had allowed power to go unchecked for so long. It wasn't just about the officers involved. It was about showing the world that the system could be fixed, that it could be reformed from the inside out. Over the next few days, her team worked tirelessly, gathering the final pieces of evidence and preparing the charges. The media, which had once been critical of her, now began to turn their attention toward the unfolding scandal. News outlets ran stories detailing the investigation, the involvement of high-ranking officers, and the woman's role in uncovering the corruption that had been hiding in plain sight for years. She knew the road ahead would be difficult. The resistance from those in power would only intensify, but she was prepared for the fight. The harder they pushed back, the stronger she became. The day came when the charges were finally made public. The woman standing alongside her team announced the arrests of several senior officers involved in the cover-up. The room filled with murmurs of disbelief and awe. This was not just a victory for her, but for the people who had been waiting for justice to prevail. She had done what so many thought was impossible. She had taken down the corruption at the heart of the department. But even as she stood there, facing the press and the public, she knew this was only the beginning. The work she had started could not be completed overnight, but she had set the wheels of change in motion. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The woman had proven that with enough willpower and determination, a single person could ignite a revolution, one that would change everything. As she walked away from the press conference, she looked out across the city, knowing that her fight was far from over. There were still those who resisted change, who would stop at nothing to hold onto their power, but she was ready. She had faced the worst, and she had emerged stronger. Now nothing could stand in her way. As the days turned into weeks, the woman continued to push forward with the reforms that had already begun to reshape the department. The arrests of the senior officers had sent shockwaves through the entire system, and while there were still those who resisted, there was no denying the momentum that was building. More officers came forward, sharing their stories, exposing the corruption that had festered within the department for years. The public's faith in the police force, once shattered by scandal and abuse of power, began to rebuild, slowly but steadily. People could see the changes happening. They could feel the difference in the way the department operated. The woman had not only taken down those who had abused their power, but she had also put in place measures to ensure that such abuses would never happen again. She knew that true change would take time. There were no quick fixes when it came to systemic corruption. But she was patient, driven by the knowledge that every small victory was a step closer to her ultimate goal: a just, accountable, and transparent police force. Her leadership, once questioned, was now admired. Officers who had once looked at her with skepticism were now standing with her, working alongside her to create a better future. The department had begun to transform from the inside out, and the woman's vision for justice was becoming a reality. Despite the progress, the fight was far from over. The woman had made it clear that no one would be allowed to rest on their laurels, and there was still much work to be done to root out the remaining elements of corruption. But she no longer faced the battle alone. She had built a team of dedicated officers, activists, and community leaders who shared her vision. Together, they were dismantling the old, broken system and replacing it with one based on trust, fairness, and respect. As the woman looked out over the city she had vowed to protect, She knew that the road ahead would be filled with challenges. There would be those who tried to tear down what she had built, those who would fight tooth and nail to hold on to their power. But she had already faced the worst, and she had come out victorious. She had proven that change was possible, that one person could make a difference, and that justice could prevail, no matter how deeply entrenched the system was. She smiled to herself, knowing that her fight was far from over, but also knowing that she had already won. The world had seen what she could do, and now nothing would stop her from achieving the transformation she had promised. With her team by her side and her resolve stronger than ever, the woman was ready to face whatever came next. She had come a long way, but this was only the beginning. The future of the police department, and the future of justice, had been forever changed.